The winter silence. The snow had fallen heavier that year than anyone in the valley could remember. By December, it was no longer a landscape, but a coffin, the land buried alive beneath a suffocating quilt of white. Horses froze mid-journey. Barns collapsed under the weight of drifts, and families huddled in log homes that groaned in protest each night as the wind howled like wolves at the door. In that silence, a man named Ezekiel Whitmore was seen trudging alone down the trail. Toward the Salt Lake settlement, his figure stooped, his eyes hollow, his beard ragged with frost. Witnesses swore he looked less like a man and more like a revenant, clawing his way back from the grave. He asked to see Bishop Curtis in private. What he told the bishop that day would ignite the most enduring mystery of the Utah Territory. 4 women, his wives, gone without a trace. Their disappearance explained by journeys no human being could have survived in that frozen wilderness. Ezekiel's voice trembled as he spoke, his hands restless and pale, as though guilty blood still clung to them unseen. The bishop would later confess in his diary that he felt in that moment the weight of something unspeakable pressing at the edges of the room. And so begins our tale, the strange and terrible story of Mr. Whitmore and his 4 wives. A case that begins with vanishing footsteps and ends with whispers no shovel of earth could silence. The arrival in the valley, Ezekiel. Whitmore was not born of the desert nor of the mountains. He came from the damp woods of Vermont, where winters were sharp but survivable, where a man could split cedar and feel warmth from the crackling hearth. In 1847, the Salt Lake Valley offered no such comfort. What Brigham Young had declared the place looked to most like a death sentence: barren soil, biting wind, and horizons that seemed to stretch toward nothingness. Whitmore came in the second wave of pioneers, after the first company had carved a fragile foothold into the wilderness. He was 34, a carpenter by trade, a convert by conviction. Yet it was not his faith nor his skill that made him stand out. It was the women. 4 wives, each bound to him by covenant, each dependent upon him for survival in this new Eden that looked far more like exile. Sarah, the eldest, was stern and practical, with eyes that had already seen too much of life's disappointments. Rebecca, sharp of mind and sharper of tongue, carried books in her trunk rather than lace. Mary, younger, delicate, pregnant, and weary from the plains, leaned on the others for strength. And Ruth, barely grown into womanhood, bright with optimism, but hollowed by loss, clung to Ezekiel as if faith itself could be personified in a husband. Together, they settled in a valley crease known as Mill Creek, a pocket of running water, tillable land, and solitude. Solitude was Ezekiel's preference. He built his cabin stout, logs notched tight, stone laid for a foundation, each wife given a room. To neighbors, the Whitmores seemed an emblem of pioneer discipline. To those who visited, however, there was something uncanny about the household, a household too harmonious. Bishop William Curtis made note of it in his journals. On December 12th, he rode the 8 miles from the Salt Lake settlement to check on the family, bringing bread and word from town. At the door he was greeted not by the chaos of a polygamous household, not the chatter of competing voices, the bustle of jealous chores, but by a serenity so perfect it unsettled him. The women moved together, like parts of one body. When one spoke, another finished her sentence. When Rebecca handed him a cup of steaming broth, Sarah simultaneously pulled the chair before the fire, as if the thought had sparked in 2 heads at once. Their smiles did not warm him. They chilled. What disturbed him most, he later confessed in his private diary, were the wrists. All 4 women bore small, deliberate cuts. They laughed it off. Accidents of cooking knives, they said. But the marks were too uniform, too symmetrical. Curtis rode away uneasy, telling himself it was nothing. Yet that night, as the wind rattled the eaves of his cabin, he dreamed of women standing in a circle, their mouths moving in unison, their wrists bleeding into a single chalice. He woke with the taste of iron on his tongue. The last sighting on December 19th, hunters passed the Whitmore cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney. Sarah and Rebecca appeared at the door, shawls wrapped tight, faces pale against the cold. They accepted venison, thanked the men, and declined the offer to attend Christmas services in town. That was the last time anyone in the valley saw the Whitmore wives alive. When Ezekiel appeared at the settlement weeks later, his explanation was as fragile as it was absurd. Sarah had heard a divine call to return east, to Missouri of all places, in the depth of winter, through snowbound passes where even seasoned trappers would not dare. She had left, he claimed, with passing travelers. Bishop Curtis pressed. Him? What travelers? From where? Ezekiel stammered. Missionaries, he said. No, mountain men. No, a band of settlers heading back. His story shifted like snow in the wind. His eyes darted to the door as if expecting someone, or dreading them. The bishop's unease deepened into suspicion. The empty rooms, by January's end, 2 more wives were gone. Ezekiel insisted they too had answered a spiritual summons eastward. Mary and Ruth had been called. This time Curtis demanded to see for himself. He gathered a small party and trudged the frozen miles to Mill Creek. The cabin loomed against the snow, smoke coughing weakly from the chimney. Inside, Ezekiel sat alone by a small fire, his beard wild, his hands trembling. The rooms of the wives lay bare, clothing gone, books gone, but the furniture remained, heavy and immovable. Who abandons hearthstones yet carries away candlesticks? Who leaves quilts but takes combs? Behind the cabin, fresh earth lay piled in uneven mounds. Ezekiel claimed he was expanding the root cellar. In frozen ground? The bishop knew better. That night, one of the visiting men awoke to the sound of weeping. Not the wind, not timbers, creaking, but voices, faint and desperate, rising from beneath the floorboards. He did not sleep again. The next morning, they left. Ezekiel's explanations hung like frost in the air, brittle and unconvincing. The diary entry in April, when the snows finally relented, Curtis returned alone. The cabin was abandoned, dust already settling like a burial shroud. In Rebecca's room, beneath a loose board, he found a journal. The last entry chilled him more than the fiercest winter wind. He says we must make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of the eternal family, but I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven. Behind the cabin, the earth told its own story, torn, disturbed, concealing fragments of fabric, a ring, the charred remains of scripture warped by fire. Curtis stopped digging. Some truths, he realized, might be too terrible to fully exhume, but he could not escape the sense, written in every shadow, whispered in every draft of wind, that the Whitmore women had not left of their own accord. They had not departed east. They had gone downward into the earth, into silence, and somewhere in the wilderness Ezekiel Whitmore walked free. The bishop sealed his notes, the church sealed its records, and the valley sealed its lips. But secrets do not die in shallow graves. 70 years later, when construction workers broke ground for a new chapel on that very site, their shovels struck stone, a chamber waiting to be opened. What they found inside was not the end of the Whitmore story. It was only the beginning. Whispers beneath the chapel. When the workers at Mill Creek first struck stone in October of 1920, they believed they'd uncovered the remains of an old well, a simple pioneer relic, nothing more. But as the dirt was cleared and the outlines of the structure revealed themselves, it became clear this was no well. It was too symmetrical, too deliberate, sealed tight as if meant not to draw water but to keep something inside. One man swore that as they lifted the first slab of stone, a rush of air escaped with such force that it extinguished the lanterns around them. It was as though the chamber itself had been waiting, holding its breath for 70 years, and now it exhaled. The men laughed nervously, brushed it off as gas or pressure, but several refused to return to the site after that day. What they found buried beneath the new chapel foundation would prove that the story of Ezekiel Whitmore had never ended. It had simply been waiting to be unearthed. The Discovery brother, Samuel Morrison, the foreman of the project, was a man of deep faith. Born in the valley long after the days of pioneers, he had grown up hearing hushed rumors about the wives in the snow. To him, they were little more than campfire stories, warnings told by mothers to frighten children into obedience. But when the workers pulled away the final stones and revealed what lay inside, those childhood stories took on a weight he could not ignore. Inside the chamber were bundles, not bones, not bodies, but belongings. 4 sets of folded garments, preserved by dryness and deliberate care. Dresses, shawls, combs, mirrors, and the most chilling of all, small purses containing documents and letters. Each bundle belonged to one of the Whitmore wives, Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth. It was not a grave. It was a memorial. And if the chamber was a memorial, then what had become of the women themselves? The letters, the documents were removed with trembling hands. At first the script appeared ordinary, the steady penmanship of pioneer women writing to distant relatives. But as the letters were read aloud, the tone shifted from mundane affection to something darker, something resolute. Sarah's letter was graceful, composed, filled with gratitude for being chosen to participate in what she called the sealing ordinance of ultimate consecration. She spoke of laying down her life so that her eternal family might rise exalted. Rebecca's was fevered, her words sprawling across the page, quoting scripture and obscure theological texts. She wrote of innocent blood opening doors in heaven, of sacrifice as currency for celestial glory. Mary's was the most heartbreaking, written in a trembling hand as she neared the end of pregnancy. She referred to her unborn child as a double offering, convinced that the shedding of 2 lives would count as twice the devotion, and Ruth's was short, almost childlike. "I am not afraid," she wrote. "We will be together forever." The letters left little doubt. The women had gone willingly. Or had they? The words could be read as devotion, or as coercion hidden beneath a veil of faith. Elder Tanner's arrival, the discovery halted construction instantly. Word traveled to Salt Lake City, and soon Elder James Tanner, one of the 12, arrived to oversee the matter. Tanner was no stranger to uncomfortable truths hidden in church archives, but nothing had prepared him for this. He ordered the letters catalogued, the artifacts secured, the site guarded. Then he did what no one else had dared. He opened the church's sealed files, searching for the original records of Bishop Curtis's investigation from 1848. The files were yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were unmistakable. Curtis had suspected murder. He had found Rebecca's journal, the cryptic line about sacrifice from a darker source. He had seen the disturbed earth behind the cabin, the ashes of strange fires, the fragments of scripture burned beyond recognition. But Curtis had stopped short. He had buried his doubts beneath silence, just as the church had buried the story beneath secrecy. Tanner realized then, the chamber beneath Mill Creek was not an accident. It was a keyhole into something larger, and whatever it unlocked, the church had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep hidden. The pattern of disappearances, as Tanner's team dug through early church records, they began to notice something chilling. The Whitmores were not alone. Between 1847 and 1855, at least a dozen families reported wives, children, or entire households vanishing. In nearly every case, the explanation was the same. They had gone east in winter, following a revelation leaving few belongings behind. No witnesses ever saw these supposed departures. No letters ever arrived from the east. And in nearly every case, the explanation came not from neighbors, but from the husbands themselves. These men were described in records as zealous, unwavering in doctrine, marked by excessive devotion. Some had positions of authority, others were simply known for their stern faith. The pattern was too exact to ignore. The Whitmore incident was not a singular madness. It was part of a network. The ritual chamber, when Tanner ordered excavation beneath, the stone chamber the workers balked. They had seen enough. They whispered about curses, about the ground itself groaning at night. Morrison, the foreman, claimed that on more than one occasion he heard voices when no one was near. Women's voices, faint, rising through the soil. But work continued, and what they found beneath the memorial chamber froze every man who entered. Carved. Into the earth was a larger chamber, 12 feet across, lined with stone symbols etched into every wall. At its center stood a granite altar, stained dark. Around it were 4 smaller platforms, each inscribed with a wife's name: Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, Ruth. And beneath those platforms, preserved by deliberate methods, lay the bodies, not scattered, not decayed, but placed with ceremonial care, dressed in white garments, each struck down by a single wound to the heart. It was not murder in the common sense, it was ritual. The implications for Tanner, the discovery, was more dangerous than any simple crime. This was not merely one man's madness, it was organized, deliberate, theological. The letters, the journals, the carvings all pointed to something called the principle of ultimate consecration, a doctrine never taught in public sermons but whispered among certain men, the belief that the greatest offering to God was not land, nor money, nor labor, but the blood of one's own family, willingly given. Tanner shuddered at the thought. This was not just Ezekiel Whitmore's obsession, this was a movement. The growing unease as word spread quietly among the men working at the site, fear began to grip Mill Creek. Children woke screaming, claiming they saw women in white at the edge of the fields. Livestock refused to enter certain pastures. One worker swore that when he touched the altar stone, his palm burned as though pressed against fire. Elder Tanner attempted to keep control, but whispers spread faster than decrees. By November, the entire valley buzzed with rumors that the church was hiding something unnatural beneath the new chapel. Tanner knew the truth was worse than rumors, for if the Whitmore case was only one piece of a larger design, then somewhere in the church's early past a group of men had twisted faith into murder, and the question that chilled him most was not whether they had existed. It was whether they had ever been stopped. The excavation continued into deeper levels. Behind a false wall, the men uncovered a narrow passage, sloping downward into darkness. The air that seeped from it was colder than winter, sharper than ice. Lanterns were lit. A team descended. What they found in that hidden chamber revealed not only the fate of the Whitmore women, but the existence of something far more terrifying. A brotherhood that had once operated in secret, bound not by love or family, but by sacrifice. At its center was a name carved in stone, a name no one present had ever heard before, and one that would unravel everything the church believed about its own beginnings. The name was Jeremiah Blackwood. The Order of Eternal Sacrifice, the discovery of Jeremiah Blackwood's name carved into the hidden chamber, did more than chill Elder Tanner. It shattered the illusion that Ezekiel Whitmore was an isolated madman. For years, the church had whispered that Whitmore had lost his mind in the isolation of Mill Creek, that grief, hunger, and religious mania had driven him to commit unthinkable acts. But here was proof, etched into cold stone, that he had not acted alone. Jeremiah Blackwood, a name absent from official records, a man erased from history, and yet in the shadows beneath the chapel, his presence lingered like a stain. Whoever he had been, he had built something far larger, far more deliberate than a single family's tragedy. This was not madness, this was order, the order of eternal sacrifice, the inner chamber. The false passage descended into a space smaller than the ritual chamber above, but crafted with greater precision. Its walls were smooth, its ceiling arched, its stones etched with an interwoven language of Mormon symbols, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and strange sigils that no one present could identify. At its center stood a stone table, polished flat, upon which maps had been carved, detailed etchings of the Utah Territory in its infancy. Settlements marked with circles, some crossed through with symbols resembling daggers, others surrounded by stars. But most disturbing were the inscriptions. Stone tablets arranged in alcoves, their surfaces covered in writing that blended scripture with something darker. Here, Tanner realized, lay the theology of the order. The principle of ultimate consecration had not been the fevered dream of a lone fanatic. It had been systematized, codified, passed down in deliberate detail. The theology of blood. The tablets told a story, or rather, a reinterpretation of stories. Passages from the Book of Mormon twisted into mandates of sacrifice. Verses from the Old Testament reframed as instructions. Ancient altars reimagined as templates for modern blood. The doctrine was chillingly clear. Families could not achieve the highest celestial glory through obedience alone. True devotion required proof, and the highest proof was the shedding of life itself willingly offered. To the order, women and children were not merely companions but vessels, offerings whose deaths would guarantee the eternal ascent of their families. Ezekiel had not invented the idea of his wife's sacrifice. He had been following instructions. Jeremiah Blackwood little is known about Jeremiah Blackwood in the official annals of Mormon history. No records of baptism. No references in pioneer journals, but within the chamber, his name appeared again and again, always preceded by a title, Revealer of the Higher Law. From the fragments of tablets, Tanner's team pieced together a chilling picture. Blackwood claimed to have been a confidant of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, privy to private revelations that others were too weak to bear. After Smith's death, Blackwood vanished from public mention, only to reappear in the shadows of the Utah migration. According to the tablets, Blackwood believed that the pioneers' suffering in the wilderness was not punishment, but preparation. A crucible to forge a people willing to sacrifice everything. He taught that plural marriage was merely the first step toward the higher law. The true test of faith lay in consecration by blood. Ezekiel Whitmore had been one of his earliest recruits. The network, the most chilling revelation, came not from theology but logistics. The tablets contained lists, names, locations, dates, families marked for initiation, settlements designated as chambers of sealing. From 1847 to 1855, the order had operated in at least 15 locations across the Utah Territory. Mill Creek was only one. The pattern of disappearances that Tanner had noticed in the archives was confirmed here in stone. Each case was not random, tragedy, but part of a coordinated plan. And the numbers were staggering. Dozens of victims, perhaps more than 200 over the span of 3 decades. The order had not been fringe. It had been embedded, hidden within the very heart of the early church. The whispered purge. Tanner's research uncovered another layer of secrecy. Around 1856, the order's activities abruptly ceased in Utah. The tablets hinted at a scattering, a purge carried out in secrecy by Brigham Young himself. Men suspected of following Blackwood were quietly stripped of authority, reassigned, or excommunicated without public explanation. Some vanished into the wilderness. Others were last seen heading west to California or Nevada, where the mining camps offered anonymity. But the purge was never spoken of in sermons or journals. Officially, the order had never existed. Unofficially, its remnants may have continued, far from Salt Lake oversight. The fear in Mill Creek as Tanner absorbed these discoveries. The workers at the excavation site became restless. Tools went missing, lanterns extinguished themselves, and more than one man reported hearing footsteps in the chamber when no one else was below. Brother Morrison, the foreman, confessed that he dreamed nightly of women in white garments, standing around his bed, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes open but blind. One morning, a worker refused to enter the chamber at all. He claimed he had seen Ezekiel Whitmore himself, standing at the edge of the site, watching. Of course, Ezekiel would have been long dead. But the man swore it was him. The same gaunt face he'd seen in sketches, the same hollow eyes. Word spread quickly. The ground was cursed. The women were restless. The order was not finished. The letter intercepted in the sealed archives, Tanner found one final piece of evidence, a letter intercepted by Bishop Curtis in 1849, never before revealed. Addressed to Ezekiel Whitmore at a Nevada mining camp, The letter was signed only with initials. J.M. Its contents were chilling. The work is accomplished according to the pattern revealed to us. Others have also fulfilled their obligations. The sealing is complete, the order is united in blood. This was proof that the Whitmore tragedy was not an isolated act, but part of an organized sequence of ritual killings. Ezekiel had not disappeared into madness. He had continued the work elsewhere, and if the order scattered after 1856, who could say how many cells continued their practices in secret beyond the church's reach? The growing dilemma Elder Tanner now faced an impossible choice. If he revealed the truth, it would shake the foundation of the church. The faithful would learn that their ancestors had harbored a secret society of ritual murderers masquerading as prophets of higher law. If he concealed it, the victims, Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, Ruth, and countless others, would remain buried in silence, their deaths swallowed by the earth. But even as Tanner wrestled with the decision, the sight itself seemed to demand resolution. The dreams grew more vivid, the whispers louder. Some nights Morrison claimed he heard prayers being recited in the chamber, voices chanting words he could not understand. The earth was no longer content with secrecy. One evening, as the excavation team prepared to seal the chamber for the night, Morrison descended one last time to collect his tools. He did not return. When the others followed with lanterns, they found his light extinguished, his tools scattered. On the altar lay his coat neatly folded as though placed there in offering, and on the wall behind the altar fresh words had been carved into the stone, words that no one had ever seen before. The blood of the fathers calls to the sons. The order shall not sleep forever. The scattered flames, by the time Brother Morrison's body was carried from the chamber, the construction site at Mill Creek had dissolved into panic. Some swore his death was natural, a collapse of the heart, the stress of too many sleepless nights. But others whispered that the women had claimed him, that the Whitmore wives were still reaching for sacrifices from beyond the grave. What unsettled Elder Tanner most was not Morrison's death itself, but the way it had been staged. His coat folded neatly on the altar, his tools arranged as though part of a ceremony, and those words freshly carved into the wall. The blood of the fathers calls to the sons. It suggested something terrible, that the order of eternal sacrifice had not truly died with the 1850s. That someone somewhere had been keeping its embers alive. The Nevada trail digging further into the sealed records, Tanner uncovered a chilling thread, references to Nevada, California, and Colorado mining camps in the 1860s and 1870s. At first, these seemed like ordinary letters about missionary work or labor opportunities. But hidden between the lines were phrases that echoed the doctrine of the order, phrases like "the sealing work continues" or "the offering is accepted." One camp in Virginia City, Nevada, had even been marked on the stone map in the chamber. Tanner sent quiet inquiries, and what returned to him was more than rumor. There had been disappearances in those camps too. Women who vanished without trace, children buried hastily with no explanation. Transient populations made it easy to dismiss as desertion or tragedy. But the pattern was unmistakable. The order had fled Utah, but it had not ceased. It had adapted, hidden itself among the lawlessness of the West. The Blackwood prophecy. The tablets in the chamber spoke of Jeremiah Blackwood's final message to his followers. It was not a farewell, but a prophecy. He wrote that the order's teachings would be revealed in due time when the faithful were ready for the higher law. Until then, the work was to be carried on quietly, each cell acting independently, preserving the rituals for the day when the church itself would embrace them. The sealing of blood shall become the crown of Zion, Blackwood wrote, and those who offered their wives, their sons, their daughters, shall be raised as princes in the celestial kingdom. For Tanner, these words were intolerable. Not merely heresy, but blasphemy. Yet the handwriting, the deliberate carving, left no doubt that these beliefs had once been followed with absolute devotion. What if some still believed? The men who remained at the construction site, fear metastasized into obsession. Some workers refused to return at all. Others lingered near the chamber, staring into the shadows as though waiting for voices. One man confessed privately to Tanner that he had begun dreaming of the women every night. Not as ghosts, but as wives. "They tell me I am chosen," he whispered, "that I must continue the work." Tanner dismissed him at first, attributing it to nerves, to suggestion. But when another man confessed the same dream, nearly word for word, Tanner realized something far darker was at play. The chamber was not merely a tomb. It was an infection. Echoes of other families. As Tanner pieced through Curtis's hidden notes, another discovery struck him cold. The Whitmores had not been unique even in their structure. Other families, scattered across the territory, had vanished under eerily similar circumstances. One such family lived near Provo in 1849. A man, his 3 wives, and 2 children. Records show they departed east in midwinter. Neighbors recalled hearing singing from their cabin in the nights before their disappearance, a strange chanting kind of hymn. When spring came, their home stood empty, food half prepared, tools abandoned. Another case emerged from the Weber River settlement. A father reported his wife and child had joined a wagon train. No wagon train was ever recorded. Behind his cabin, freshly turned earth was found, though no one dared dig it up. Piece by piece, the picture became undeniable. The order had been everywhere, hidden in plain sight, using faith itself as camouflage. The living flame one night in November 1920, as snow dusted the unfinished chapel site, Elder Tanner returned alone to the chamber. Lantern in hand, he stood before the altar, staring at the stain that had outlasted generations, and then he heard it. Not a voice from memory, not a dream, but a clear whisper behind him. A woman's voice. Soft, calm, as though standing at his shoulder. "Do not bury us again." Tanner spun, lantern swinging, but the chamber was empty. His hands trembled. For the first time, he felt not merely the weight of history, but the demand of the dead. He left that night with a new conviction. Whatever choice the church made, silence would no longer hold. The decision at Salt Lake on November 15th, Tanner presented his findings to the First Presidency and the 12. For 3 hours he spoke, laying out letters, maps, and the chilling theology of Jeremiah Blackwood. The room grew heavier with each revelation. Men shifted uncomfortably, brows furrowed, hands clenched. At the end, President Heber J. Grant stood. His decision was swift. The evidence would be sealed, the site filled and forgotten. The truth was too dangerous, too explosive. It could not be allowed to stain the church's reputation or unsettle the faith of millions. Tanner left the meeting with a pit in his stomach. He had fulfilled his duty to report, but not his duty to the dead. The haunting of Mill Creek back at the site. Work resumed reluctantly. Concrete was poured into the chambers, sealing forever what lay beneath. But the men who had labored there carried something with them that could not be sealed away. One worker, weeks later, drowned in Mill Creek under strange circumstances. Another shot himself, leaving behind a note that contained only 4 words. "They are still calling." Families in the valley began to report disturbances, shadows moving across their windows at night, strange women singing at the edge of fields, the sound of children crying where no children lived. The church dismissed it all as superstition. But those who had seen the chamber knew better. The order's legacy had not been buried. It had been loosed. In early December, just as the last of the concrete was poured, Tanner received a letter delivered without return address. The paper was old, the ink faded, but the words were sharp. "You have opened the way. The work continues. The order does not die." It was signed simply, J.B. Jeremiah Blackwood had supposedly vanished 70 years earlier. But if the letter was to be believed, someone was still carrying his name and his work. The blood that remains. When Elder Tanner held the anonymous letter in his hands, its faded ink and curling paper made him tremble more than any discovery in the chamber itself. The initials alone, J.B., were enough to make his blood run cold. Jeremiah Blackwood was supposed to be long dead, a ghost from Utah's earliest years. Yet here in 1920, his name returned as if carried by the hand of time itself. And if the letter was genuine, it meant the unthinkable. The order of eternal sacrifice had not been destroyed. It had endured, adapting, waiting. The ground beneath Mill Creek might have been sealed in concrete, but something far older, far hungrier had been let loose. The shadow over Mill Creek December brought more than snow. Families in the valley began reporting strange disturbances. Lamps blew out for no reason. Livestock refused to drink from the creek. Children woke screaming that women in white stood by their beds. Neighbors whispered that the construction site had cursed the town. The men, who had worked there, carried it most heavily. Several fell ill with fevers no doctor could explain. One muttered about voices calling his name. Another claimed his reflection moved when he did not. And every night Brother Morrison's widow swore she heard knocking beneath the floorboards, as though her husband's restless spirit had not left the chamber at all. The letter's warning Tanner studied the anonymous letter obsessively. Its handwriting bore similarities to the inscriptions on the stone tablets, but it was fresher, steadier, as if penned within weeks. The message was clear. The work continues. The order does not die. But how? Blackwood himself would have been in his 70s or 80s by the 1870s. If he survived longer, he'd be well over 100 by 1920. Impossible, unless his name had been assumed by another. Perhaps J.B. was not Jeremiah Blackwood but his heir, a disciple keeping the doctrine alive. The letter had not been mailed. It had been hand-delivered, slipped beneath Tanner's door while guards were posted outside. That meant the author was close. Watching, perhaps even within Mill Creek itself. The surviving cells digging deeper into the sealed archives, Tanner uncovered disturbing evidence that church agents had tracked order activity well after the supposed purge. Mining camps in Nevada, remote ranches in Colorado, and even a settlement in Idaho all bore signs of ritual disappearances. One report, dated 1875, described a chamber in Virginia City eerily similar to Mill Creek's, complete with altar, inscriptions, and bodies dressed in ceremonial garments. The chamber had been destroyed by churchmen in secrecy, its records locked away. But if one cell had lasted that long, how many others had gone undetected, and who among their descendants might still carry the teachings? The dreams of the workers. Mid-December, 3 of the construction workers began sharing the same recurring dream. In it, they stood in the chamber surrounded by the 4 Whitmore wives. The women did not speak. They simply extended their hands, palms up, wrists scarred with identical cuts. One man woke to find his wrists marked with shallow scratches, though he swore he had not touched a blade. Another was found sleepwalking toward the construction site at midnight, muttering that he had been called. Tanner began to suspect that the order's power was not only historical. The rituals themselves had left something behind, a lingering contagion of faith and blood that could ensnare new minds long after the original practitioners were gone. The return of the hymnet began on Christmas Eve. Families gathered in their cabins heard faint singing carried on the wind. At first they assumed it was neighbors caroling, but the tune was strange, minor, winding in circles instead of resolving. The words were indistinct, but witnesses swore they included phrases about sacrifice, sealing, and eternal families. The sound seemed to come from the hills near the construction site. When men investigated with lanterns, the singing ceased, but footprints were found in the snow, not leading toward the site, but away from it. Multiple sets, side by side, vanishing abruptly as though swallowed by the earth. The hymn of the Yoizanti order had returned. The confession one night, a young laborer named Peter Holt came to Tanner's quarters, pale and shaking. He confessed that he had been approached by strangers, men in dark coats who claimed to be brethren of the higher law. They told him the time had come to continue the work, that he had been chosen. "They knew things about me," Holt whispered. "Things I never told a soul. They said my great-grandfather was one of them. They said blood calls to blood." When Tanner pressed him, Holt described their appearance, ordinary, unremarkable, like any Mormon elders. But their eyes, he said, were empty, like windows with no house behind them. Holt disappeared 2 days later. His coat was found neatly folded on the doorstep of the meeting house. The panic in Salt Lake. When news of Holt's disappearance reached Salt Lake City, Tanner begged the First Presidency to act. He argued that the order was not history but present, that its descendants were active, recruiting, perhaps even planning new sacrifices. But the presidency refused. They insisted the disturbances were hysteria, the byproduct of digging into secrets best left buried. The official position remained. The Mill Creek site was geological anomaly, nothing more. Tanner realized then that the institution would never confront the truth. The order's legacy threatened not just history, but faith itself. To reveal it would mean dismantling the very foundations of belief. If he wanted answers, he would have to find them alone. The second chamber in late December, Tanner returned to the construction site against orders. He descended into the lower levels before the last of the concrete was poured. Lantern in hand, he searched for any sign of further passages, and he found one. Behind a slab of stone at the far wall lay another narrow tunnel, smaller than the first, twisting deeper into bedrock. The air was colder, damp, and heavy with a smell like iron. At the tunnel's end lay a chamber no larger than a single room. Its walls were bare, save for one carving, the sigil of a circle split by a blade, and on the floor were 4 child-sized garments folded neatly, untouched by decay. Tanner fell to his knees. The Whitmore wives had not been the final sacrifices. Children, too, had been offered. The order's depravity reached deeper than even he had feared. The mark of blood when Tanner returned to the surface. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold the lantern. Yet as he looked down, he froze. His palms bore faint red lines, not scratches but scars, in the exact shape of the sigil carved on the wall, a circle split by a blade. He had not touched the carving. He had not touched anything. And yet, the mark was there, burned into his skin as though claimed. That night, as Tanner tried to pray, he heard movement outside his quarters. Footsteps, a knock at the door. When he opened it, no one was there. Only an envelope resting neatly on the step. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You have been chosen, Elder Tanner. The work is not finished. The children must be sealed." The letter was signed with the same initials as before. J.B. The last revelation. The letter lay heavy in Elder Tanner's hand, though it weighed no more than paper. "You have been chosen, Elder Tanner. The work is not finished. The children must be sealed." And beneath it, the initials that had haunted him for weeks. J.B. For days, Tanner told no one. He could not. If the church refused to believe the order was alive, then confessing his own mark, the sigil burned inexplicably into his palms, would only brand him a madman. Yet every night, the dreams grew sharper. 4 women standing in white, hands outstretched, blood on their wrists. And now children appeared beside them, faces pale, eyes unblinking, their small voices whispering, "Join us." Tanner knew one thing with certainty. The order had not died. And whether through blood or belief, it wanted him. The children of Mill Creek. The first sign came in January of 1921, as snow weighed heavy on the rooftops. A farmer's boy vanished while fetching water from the creek. His bucket was found upright on the bank, no prints in the snow leading away. The next week, a young girl failed to return from an errand to her neighbor's house. Lantern-bearing, men searched all night. They found her shoes, placed side by side at the edge of the old meeting house site, as if she had removed them willingly. Panic spread through the valley. Some blamed wolves, others kidnappers. But whispers of the order returned with a vengeance. Had the sacrifices begun again? The return of the hymnon. The night of the second disappearance, the hymn was heard again, faint, winding, mournful. This time, multiple families swore they heard the words clearly. Blood binds, blood seals, blood exalts. The voices were not distant but near, circling cabins, moving in the snow. Some claimed to see lanterns drifting among the trees. Others said they saw figures in white, moving silently against the drifts. And then the hymn would stop, all at once, leaving behind only silence thick enough to choke the lungs. The descent into silence. Tanner returned to the sealed site. Concrete now covered the ritual chamber, smooth and gray, yet he swore he could still hear faint knocking beneath it. He pressed his ear to the cold slab, and in the silence, he heard words, muffled, indistinct, but words nonetheless. Bring them. He staggered back, clutching his hands, which still bore the scarred sigil. He realized with dawning horror that the order did not need flesh and blood leaders anymore. The rituals had left an imprint. A place once steeped in blood could carry a will of its own. Mill Creek was not haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by memory, ritual, and faith so twisted it had taken on life of its own. The legacy of Blackwood weeks. Later, Tanner received a second anonymous envelope. This time inside was not a letter but a list. Children's names. Local children, all from Mill Creek families. Several already missing, others still safe. And at the top of the list, to be sealed by fire, January 21st, 1921. The date was only 3 nights away, and beneath it, the work of Jeremiah Blackwood shall not be buried. The night of fire on, the night of January 21st, snow fell thick across the valley, muffling every sound. Families huddled inside their cabins, too frightened to sleep, and then the dogs began barking. Lanterns flickered. From the old meeting house site, fire erupted. Not wild but controlled. Torches arranged in a circle around the concrete slab that sealed the chamber. Figures stood around it, cloaked, hooded, their shadows bending against the flames. And at their center were 3 children, bound, but unharmed, eyes wide with terror. Tanner rushed forward with a lantern, shouting for help. But the figures did not scatter. They turned toward him as one, their hoods falling back. They were not strangers. They were men he knew. Neighbors, fellow elders, even one who had sat beside him in church council meetings. Their eyes were glazed, hollow, but their voices were steady as they chanted the hymn. Blood binds. Blood seals. Blood exalts. The choice Tanner raised his lantern, ready to swing it as a weapon. But then the chanting stopped. One of the figures stepped forward and spoke. His voice was calm, almost sorrowful. Elder Tanner, you are chosen. The blood calls to you. Place your hands upon the children, seal them, and the work will be fulfilled. You bear the mark. It is you they wait for. Tanner's palms burned, the sigil glowing red as though alive. He felt an overwhelming pull, a pressure in his chest, a voice in his mind whispering, yes, yes, complete it, and you will save them, all. For a moment he nearly obeyed, but then he looked at the children, crying, shivering, clutching one another in fear. And in that instant the spell cracked. These were not offerings, they were victims. No, Tanner whispered. Not again. Not ever again. The breaking of the circle. He hurled the lantern at the torches. Flames leapt, scattering sparks. The circle broke. The hooded figures shrieked as if burned, stumbling back into the snow. Tanner rushed to the children, cutting their bindings with his pocket knife, pulling them close. The figures tried to advance, chanting louder, but their rhythm faltered without the circle. And then, the ground beneath the concrete slab shuddered. A deep hollow rumble shook the earth. Cracks split the frozen soil. From beneath the sealed chamber came a sound like hundreds of voices wailing in unison. The hooded men screamed, covering their ears, and fled into the night. The children sobbed in Tanner's arms as he dragged them away from the site. Behind them the fire died suddenly, snuffed out by a wind that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The silence. After by dawn, the valley was quiet. No trace of the hooded men could be found. The torches were gone. Only the cracked concrete slab remained, now marked with new fissures that glowed faintly as if embers smoldered beneath. The children were safe, though none could describe clearly what had happened. They remembered singing, hands upon their heads, and the promise that they would join the eternal family. Tanner reported everything to the First Presidency, but once again, they refused to acknowledge it. The official record stated only that a disturbance had occurred at the Mill Creek construction site, exaggerated by hysteria. But Tanner knew the truth. The order was not dead. It was not even sleeping. It was waiting. Tanner's final record before his death decades later, Elder Tanner left behind one sealed statement found among his private papers. The Whitmore wives were not the end. Jeremiah Blackwood was not the end. The order of eternal sacrifice is not a thing of men alone, but a faith twisted into hunger. It clings to places, to names, to bloodlines. I bore its mark. I heard its voices. And I tell you this: it will rise again wherever faith and desperation meet. The work is never finished. The only hope is vigilance and remembrance. Today, Mill Creek is a suburban neighborhood. Shopping centers, houses, and schools cover the land where Ezekiel Whitmore's cabin once stood, where the chamber once whispered beneath the chapel foundation. Children play in the fields. Families gather in meeting houses. Few know the story of the Whitmore wives or the order that nearly consumed them all, but every winter, when the snow falls thick and the nights grow long, some residents swear they hear it still. Faint singing, carried on the wind, blood binds, blood seals, blood exalts. And if you walk the streets late at night, you may notice something else. At the edge of Mill Creek, where the old meeting house once stood, the concrete slab still lies beneath the soil. Cracked, waiting. The story of Ezekiel Whitmore and his 4 wives began as a tragedy of faith in the winter of 1847. But what was uncovered 70 years later proved something far darker, that some sacrifices never end, and some secrets refuse to stay buried. And perhaps tonight, as the wind howls outside your window, you'll ask yourself, is the order truly gone, or has it only begun again, waiting for the faithful to hear its call?